Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We are doing a paper reading today on LLMs-as-Judges. This is a survey paper, so they go through a whole lot of information. Nick and I are going to go through some of it, not all of it, so we definitely recommend you take a look at the paper, but I think we've distilled out a lot of the important information and the stuff that you should really care about. Before we get into it, do we want to do a little intro? Do you want to start us off, Nick?
Yeah, my name is Nicholas Van Nest. I'm a developer advocate here at Arise. Recently joined, and yeah, I've been really looking forward to going over this paper with you guys. And just LLMs in general are just super exciting right now. So this will be a lot of fun.
Yeah. And hey everyone, I'm Sally Ann, a product manager here at Arise. I spend a lot of my day working on our AI assistant Copilot, so a lot of this material is something that I think about every day. I am building new evals and using them, so LLM-as-a-Judge is definitely a powerful technique. And when I'm not, working on our product, I'm working with a lot of customers, so definitely have a lot of knowledge of this from, the industry. So I'm super excited to get into it. But yeah, let's dive in then.
That's great.
Cool. And one more note before we get started, we love these to be interactive. So if you have any questions, something you want us to talk a little bit more about, or something that's maybe not mentioned that you want to chat about, feel free to drop it in either the Q&A or the chat. We'll be watching it, and we'll do some live answering as we go along. And then also we'll try to save some time at the end to have a good discussion. But before we get into actual paper, we're trying something a little bit new. These last few paper readings is first doing a little bit of AI industry updates. This industry is moving so fast. I find myself having a little bit of a hard time keeping up with everything. So I'm sure there's some folks that feel the same. So we just wanted to call out some cool things that we're seeing. The first one I have listed here is Google DeepMind's released Gemini 2.0 and Project Astra. What I thought was really interesting about this release is that they specifically called out like an AI model designed for the agentic era. I feel like in the last 6 months, agents are getting more and more popular. I'm seeing a lot of content around them, a lot of projects around them. So it's interesting to see Google kind of make this specific call out to this agentic era. And I'm really excited to see what else comes there. The second piece we have here, oops, sorry, is the Apple is working with Broadcom to develop its own AI processor chips. I'm sure it's no secret, NVIDIA, it's kind of the main supplier of AI processor chips. So it's interesting to see Apple kind of to join there as a player. I'm of the thought that, our infrastructure, the AI chips there are going to go hand in hand with what we're able to accomplish with the models. So I'm personally excited to see that grow. And then last thing here, if you haven't seen it, OpenAI has decided to do essentially 12 days of AI releases. I think today is day 10. I didn't add that here. But these are the last 9 releases. Lots here. I'm just going to talk about some of the ones that I think are notable. I think Sora is really cool. This is like text to video. The visuals there are pretty insane. Definitely recommend trying it out. We also have the, partnership between OpenAI, Apple, with the Apple Intelligence being released with the latest iOS update. They have some funny ones in there, like advanced voice with like the Santa mode, which is interesting, as well as some like more serious ones, like the new developer tools, the Canvas, the ability to actually, get the code, edit in real time, but then also play that or run that code in their UI now is pretty powerful. So really exciting releases coming from them, and I'm excited to see what, the next 3 days have in store for us. But yeah, that's a little bit of industry updates. Let's get into the good stuff, the paper.
Sounds great.
All right. So in case anybody's not aware of what an LM as a judge is, we kind of want to do a little bit of an intro to it. So the purpose of them is to evaluate outputs or really actually any part of an LLM application for quality, relevance, accuracy. These are just a few. We'll get into a lot more later on. There's a whole bunch of applications, but it's pretty much going to be any LLM application that these are going to be applicable to. This particular paper calls out things like summarization, dialogue, coding. The reason folks want to use LLM as a judge rather than like human annotation is because it's scalable, it's consistent. There's a lot of interpretable results from this using things like explanations. And then it reduces dependency on human evaluation. We see a lot of folks turning to LLM as a judge. There are some things like code evaluators or strictly human evaluation, but we are seeing LLM as a judge used the most. And it's a super, super powerful tool as long as you implement it in the right way. Nick, anything you want to add here on the introduction side? Anything I missed?
I think you covered it. Yeah. It's been really interesting kind of like looking at these LMs as a judge and seeing how they perform, and kind of I've been doing a little bit of research around this and tuning my own models. So yeah, they're super cool. There's so much you can do to, like, I love the data side. So kind of like start to annotate your data sets with these judgments, these categorical values. It's going to be really cool to see the different applications of them come into production.
Totally. And we're gonna get into all that in a little bit. So here's kind of what the paper focuses on. Now we're gonna cover some of these. Some of these we're gonna skip over just for time. Definitely recommend you check it out if you have any questions about how to get started with LM-Judge. But these are like the five kind of pillars that they focus on. So they focus on the functionality, like why, the methodology, how, the applications where, meta evaluation, and then as well as like some limitations for LLM judges. So these are kind of the main things we're going to focus on here today. Cool. Let's start with input types. So there are about 3 input types that this paper calls out. So we have point-wise evaluation. This is focusing on one item at a time. You can think about this as like, is my output correct? Here's a prompt template. Here's my output. Can you tell me that whether or not this output is correct? You also can do pairwise evaluation. So which of these items is better? So comparing, 2 or more items, like which summary captures the main idea better. I feel like I see this pairwise evaluation being used a lot when we get into like experiments. Maybe you're making a change to which model you're using or a prompt template, and you want to maybe compare your ground truth to this new output and decide which one's better. That's a really great example of like a pairwise evaluation. Can also be used in applications where, you might have your model actually at like inference time creating 2 summaries or creating 2 outputs, but I commonly see it used on the like experiment side of things. And then list-wise evaluation. So if you're doing any sort of ranking or getting an output that, the LLM puts out like 5 outputs, a list-wise evaluation is going to rank them. So you can understand like this list, which is the best, which is the worst, and kind of understand that relevance through sorting.
Yeah, and you'll see, like, a common example many of you might have encountered is with ChatGPT. They have like occasionally they'll throw in like a comparison, and they're actually so they'll give 2 different responses and have the user judge which one's the better response, which I think is really great because you're essentially like outsourcing that judgment to your customer and using that then to improve your model. And they're doing it on like sort of a random basis, so it's not with every single response. So I think it's much more palatable that way for the customer.
Yeah, that's a really great example that I'm sure, many in the audience have probably experienced. I know I get that all the time.
Yeah.
Cool.
In
Uh,
terms of,
yeah,
uh, I'm happy to take this one. Yeah.
no,
In terms
that's all.
of evaluation input criteria, for what you're evaluating, you might look at a variety of different things. One of them is linguistic quality, for example, like fluency, coherence, grammatical accuracy, conciseness. Could be content accuracy. So you might have your input and you have context provided, and then you have the response that's being generated by your LLM application and production. You have this LM as a judge sitting on top and like looking for made up facts or maybe too much elaboration, stuff like that. And then you have task specific metrics. So informativeness, completeness, diversity. Like let's say you want a diverse set of responses, not just, a suggestion for one specific product. You want multiple products referred to. That can be something you're looking at. And then user experience. So like how helpful or intuitive the output feels to users. So for the key takeaway, these are just examples, but the right criteria depend on the application context and input from the stakeholders. Sally, and I think you emphasize this a lot.
Absolutely. I get on, calls with customers or I talk to people in the community, and there's this mistrust kind of around LLM-as-Judge. There's people that can feel like they don't work right. And when I really drill in with people, I really feel like they don't take the time to actually define what the right criteria even is for their application. And I think that idea of using your input from stakeholders is really, really important. So before anybody even starts, getting started with, LM-as-a-Judge for evaluations, I always suggest that they take some time to understand, like, what does the success criteria even look like? What does it mean for their application to be performing well? Is it just answering the question correctly? Especially in things with agents, you not only want to understand is the question being answered correctly, but did it make the right right function call? Did this function have the right arguments? Like totally understanding your system. And so I definitely recommend anybody here who's thinking about using LM as a judge to spend some time digging in on that criteria and really define those, and then go and create, your prompt templates, those LM as a judge evals. I think you'll just see way more success with them, and you'll get way better results. So yeah, that's kind of my takeaway there on that.
Yeah, amazing. In terms of, many of us are familiar with this. You have different types of references that you can use. You can use reference-based evaluation, which essentially, like, you could think of it as RAG, but also you can be using like other types, curated data that's not just being pulled from a database. It could be like you have your traces that are coming from your production application, and then you have like manually, provided some data. You also have reference-free evaluation, which is just using the information that's baked into the model. So both of those are very valuable. In terms of the outputs, something that we typically mainly think about the primary output. So you have your production model, it's generating responses, and then your LLM as a judge is sitting on top, generating scores or rankings or assigning categorical values. Essentially, example would be, is it factual, is it hallucinated, or maybe you might have a third category like, is it ambiguous, whether it's factual or hallucinated, or is it taking too much liberty there? Something to a catch-all. You also might have these other outputs like explanations. So, this would be an explanation of why a given category was given, and also something like feedback. So, with the given response that your production app is producing, how can you improve it? And like this gives like more of like an auditability and like observability aspect that can really like help you start to understand your application quickly. I mean, somebody can go through and look at the inputs and the outputs and make a judgment about them. But having this extra text here being like, here's exactly why, a result was given can drastically make that simpler and give you like a much richer data set to work with. In terms of evaluation systems, the classic example is single LLM systems. So those are simple, they're scalable, and you'll often see something like that. You also might have a multi-LLM system. So that would be like collaboration or competition, different LLMs creating responses, and then maybe one that's judging the best response. And then the example that I really love is human AI collaboration systems. So this would be a system where you are having a human looking at the responses of your LM as a judge and determining whether those are correct responses. And I kind of gave that example earlier of like that can happen both on an engineer using like the Arise platform can just be looking and manually annotating. Also, there's a lot of like functionality in Arise that lets you, provide that to your customers and gather data from your customers to get really rich data sets that involve that human uh, evaluation.
Yeah, I see this human AI collaboration, like that should be, I think, the gold standard there. It's like you should use LLM as a judge. It's going to save you time. It's going to save you money, but you do need that human in the loop to try to kind of make sure you know where your eval is going wrong. And I think another thing I often talk about is that evals are not a set it and forget it. You set what you think is right, and then you kind of observe it, and you're going to be adjusting these and improving them over time. And the best way you can do that is with data. And so what you're describing there is a way you can do this: annotate, save it off to a data set, then you can use that to actually optimize your eval template. But I think that's the gold standard there. We actually have a question from the audience about the numerical output, any feedback mechanism to it being correct or not. And one thing I wanted to call out on this one is, I think you might have already mentioned this, Nick, a little bit, is we definitely recommend using kind of categorical labels when it comes to LM as a judge. We have some research on this, and some other papers have been released on it as well. The LMs just don't do that well when it comes to producing numerical outputs. And it is really kind of hard to know whether or not it's correct. It does depend on what you're trying to evaluate. There are some like kind of code-based mechanisms you can use to ensure that it's correct. But if that's the case, you probably should just be using code to evaluate in the first place. So that would be my hint there is try to use labels. Even if you have something like 1 to 5 and you want to score, try to associate those with natural language. I think you'll just get way better results there.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on this, like, when you give input to an LLM, it will often give you like a variety of outputs, different texts each time. And so, in these zero shot situations, you're essentially, you're having it score, but it doesn't necessarily know all of the prior scores that it's given in the past. And so, oftentimes like doing a comparison doing side by side comparisons between traces can give you like a better understanding of like which was a better response, which was a worse response. Those are things that you can look into. But yeah, also, having sometimes it helps to have like a rubric, which would be like, a score from 0 to 1 has these characteristics, score to 1 to 5 has these characteristics. That can help kind of like bin your responses and offer greater consistency.
Totally.
For the functionality of LLMs judges, there's like different types of evaluations. You have responses evaluations, which you can think of this as looking at individual responses and then adding statistics about those responses. So you might have an accuracy, relevance, coherence, fluency score that's being generated. And then for model evaluation, this is more of like an aggregate. So you might have a specific domain, like your input is a set of coding examples or translation examples. And what you're doing is instead you're kind of aggregating the performance over that corpus of data in order to characterize the performance with that type of data specifically. So you might use these individual responses to then aggregate them and give an overall score. For model enhancement, there's a few different types of enhancement that can be performed. One of them is reward modeling. You have your LLM in production, you have your LLM as a judge, looking at how each response came out, and then applying a score or a categorical value that can be then used to train your data set. And I love how easy like Arise makes it to, kind of curate data sets and like really specify there what the sets of traces that you want to use or labels you want to use for future training. Additionally, you can have acting as a verifier where your LLM is essentially looking at a variety of responses and finding the best one. So the example I think is like if you have customers who often are asking the same question and your LLM is often coming back with responses, you might have a response that's like, the most brand aligned, the most product aligned, like all the different things that you're trying to best convey to your user and give them the best experience possible. So when you use an LLM as a judge, you can have it actually select for those best responses, and then tune a model that will favor those outcomes, which can be super helpful. Then the last one is feedback for refinement. So, you have an LLM in production, it's producing a result. You have your LLM as a judge generate feedback on that result and make suggestions, and then that could be used for tuning a downstream model to, incorporate that feedback. And then data construction, and I love data here, so this is actually my favorite slide. Uh, for data annotation, and oftentimes there's been cases where GPT-4 can outperform crowd workers or some other LLM can be used to essentially automate labeling with high accuracy. For data quality enhancements, like let's say you have a response that's being generated by your production app, you might want to assign a category to that response. Was it factual? Was hallucinated? What you can do is you can force a logical explanation, which would be like, it's factual because this section of text was represented in the inputs, and then have it suggest a label. And so that way you're not just getting like a label without any context, you're actually getting a logical process like outlined in natural language, and you can use that for training purposes and to, this also can improve the labeling itself, like the performance of the labeling. The one that I think is really cool is active learning. So I'm going to use the categorical example again. Essentially, when you have categories that you're judging between, factual, hallucinated, there might be examples or traces where there's ambiguity. And your LLM in production might not be able to like clearly, make a good differentiation there. So what you do is you can focus on those examples of uncertainty and have those specifically sent to human labelers. And then when that comes back, that can be used to train the model. And so what you're essentially doing there is you're reducing the amount of like labeling costs that you need to do because you're curating a data set of just the cases where your traces are uncertain and making that line between different categories much clearer, which I love. I think that's super cool. For data synthesis, generating synthetic data sets can be super effective. You might like, for example, let's say you have bias in your data set. It could be like gender bias or, yeah, racial bias or something like that. And you want to make sure that you're providing a good customer experience for everybody involved. You can actually use synthetic data uh, sorry, excuse me. You can use data to create balance and resample there, which can be super effective.
Cool. Well, we just kind of give you a lot of information on kind of the hows and the whys of LM as a judge. So we wanted to kind of zoom out a little bit and go over some of the applications that are covered in this paper. So you can see here we've jotted down some like general evaluation use cases. I think one that's probably very familiar to maybe the audience here is like summarization and RAG system. So ensuring that like in a summarization use case that it's actually fluent and cohere, consistent. And then for RAG, understanding whether or not that the generated output was actually relevant to the context that's received, making sure we're grabbing the right context. I'm really excited about the multimodal evaluations. I think this is something that's going to be increasing in popularity, especially as we have these new kind of multimodal models. We have audio support now with the real-time API, and I think other models will kind of follow with that. So I think that's going to be an area that grows. And then there's, of course, the domain-specific evaluation. So anything that's an application that's specific to the domain, we're going to have that kind of evaluation as well. And again, these are just things that the paper kind of calls out. This can be anything that your application or anything that is relevant to your application, and it's really going to define or be defined by whatever your evaluation criteria is and what that success criteria is based on that, domain and stakeholder needs there. Why don't, just for time's sake, I think let's skip this slide here and just go on to limitations just quickly. So last slide's just kind of a little bit on metrics, but I want to talk some of the limitations when it comes to LM as a judge. So these are limitations that the paper calls out. I think you could argue that there's more based on like community perception of LM as a judge. But there's definitely, bias and fairness concerns, lack of domain expertise, prompt sensitivity, vulnerability to adversarial inputs, as well as them being resource intensive. So these are just like limitations that they put forward. I think some of them, in my opinion, are actually not as much of a limitation. Like I think bias and fairness is one of them. I think this is definitely something that should be considered, especially if you're doing anything in a sensitive area, something like working with medical data or anything that's going to really impact a human being and has the opportunity to make unfair output for that human being. But I will say that I feel that a lot of these LLM providers, they do have like these red tape teams in place. They are doing a lot to try to mitigate this risk here. So I think out of all of these, this is the one like as an end user, I would be the less concerned about. Again, not saying we should ever ignore it. It's something that should always be paid attention to, especially in those sensitive issues. But I just think from the LLM providers, we're getting a lot of protections there. And then we can talk, I guess, go to the next slide here and just talk quickly about like mitigating these.
Yeah.
If you are concerned about bias and fairness, I think you should definitely regularly audit for them, have an eval on fairness, on bias to ensure you have a signal that this is happening in your application. Enhancing the domain expertise, I really feel like, by incorporating stakeholders and subject matter experts to define criteria, you can kind of overcome this limitation. If you throw something basic on your model with an LM as a judge, you might experience this lack of domain expertise. But I think if you define your criteria, you might not notice it as much. And I also think adding, human evaluators to these really complex tasks as another layer will be really helpful. I think, making sure you have standard prompts is good for any concerns around prompt sensitivity. And I also think just like, again, having an eval on that, if that's a concern of yours, is another great way to have a signal and be able to take a further step, like a guardrail or something, or adding further instructions to your prompts. And then lastly is just computational costs. I think, optimizing your pipelines and then also using smaller task-specific evaluations when possible. It's going to help you with cost a little bit there. Um, cool. Let's start with takeaways here. You want to kick us off?
Yeah, so LLMs as evaluators are like very versatile and can be applied in a range of applications. They can assess responses, models, and data sets across various domains and tasks. The evaluation is context specific, so the success depends on well-defined criteria aligned with stakeholder goals and application needs, as Sally Ann said. And then there are some challenges. Bias and scalability and prompt variability highlight the need for careful design and oversight. And then, yeah, human AI collaboration matters. So, yeah, just those examples of like using, Arise's ability to, add human annotations is like a great example of, making sure that you're incorporating feedback. And there's ways to do that scalably using your customer feedback as well. Um, and then beyond the paper, practical success requires creativity, iterative testing, and integration with broader workflows. So, yeah,
Perfect.
all of that.
Yeah, I think this paper is really cool. It's a great survey if you have questions on what an LLM-as-Judge, what are the things that you're thinking about. I think it's definitely worth the read. I think, Nick, I think we did a good job distilling some of the main points, but I definitely think it's not super reading the full thing. We've got just 2 minutes left. There's one other user question here, so I'm going to give it a go, try to answer it quickly. They're asking, is eval criteria provided by any domain-specific governing bodies for public references? I do really feel like you have to consider like what your specific application is. There isn't kind of a one size fits all when it comes to evals. What I will say is like ourselves and many others have put forward some best practices when it comes to evals or some eval templates you can use. Something like, QA correctness or hallucination for RAG systems, code synthesis evals. We also have things around like function calling. So I think Phoenix and Arise are a great resource for kind of having a good jumping off point, but I think always they're meant to be iterated on. They're meant to be in your own context, your own subject matter expertise to them. But I think that's a really great resource for you if you're looking for something to get started with some eval criteria there.
Yeah, I see Sarah posted a link to that in the chat. So, there you
Yeah,
go.
perfect. Definitely check it out and find Nick or myself in the community Slack channel. We're also able to help you out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can try to go quickly about like our workflows. So if anybody here is not familiar, we have an AI assistant Copilot in our UI. I create evals all the time for Copilot. I actually have some blog posts on like lessons learned and how we use Arise for our workflows. But I think at a very high level, we spend time identifying what needs to be evaluated, what that success criteria is. We use Copilot a lot of times to generate our templates for us so that I don't have to do any prompt engineering when it comes to that. And then there's just this monitoring, visualizing, observing, doing analysis on these outputs to understand like where I might need to improve my application, where I might need to add more evals. So it's a very kind of iterative process, but definitely check out the blog and I'm happy to kind of, find me LinkedIn on Slack and I can go into way more detail, but I know we're at time here. So that was my really super quick answer to that.
That was great. I felt like you covered it.
Awesome.
Um,
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Nick, this was so much fun. We'll have to do another one soon.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the great questions as well.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Take care.